We proceed now to the final plenary of our conference. Dr. Sona Farid-Arbab will be speaking on advancing in Bahá'í-Inspired education. Dr. Sona Farid-Arbab has a master's in history of Chinese education from Beijing Normal University and a PhD in the philosophy of education from the University of London. She has worked extensively in China and is currently an advisor to the Moral Education Research Center at the Beijing Academy of Educational Sciences. From 2003 to 2013, she served as a director of OSED, the Office of Social and Economic Development at the Baha'i World Center. It is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Farid-Arbab to our stage.
I would like to thank the Executive Committee for inviting me to participate in this marvelous and uplifting conference. As we all know, Baha'i efforts in education has a long history, dating back to the early years of the faith in Iran. And although much has been achieved over the decades, it has been clear to all who have contributed to these efforts that the vision of what may be called Baha'i education is a distant one. There is as yet no such thing as a Baha'i curriculum, the guardian stated, and he explained further that the task of formulating a system of education which would be officially recognized by the cause and enforced as such throughout the Baha'i world is one which the present-day generation of believers cannot obviously undertake, and which has to be gradually accomplished by Baha'i scholars and educationalists of the future. That the emergence of Baha'i education is a distant goal does not mean, of course, that we do not have a great deal of work to do in this field. According to a statement prepared by the World Center in 1993 and approved by the Universal House of Justice, the gradual development of contents and methods of Baha'i education will most probably occur as the result of the diverse activities of an increasing number of educators working in varied cultural and ecological settings throughout the world. Systematic research and high-quality academic study are called for, not as isolated activities, but as components, albeit important ones, of a process in which the design of curricula is closely connected with educational practice and systematization of educational experience. A concept that has been of great assistance to those striving to visualize the gradual evolution of educational efforts throughout the Baha'i world in recent decades is that of Bahá'í-Inspired education. It has allowed Baha'is to become fully involved in hundreds of educational efforts, free from the pressure created by the expectation that our endeavors will, in a relatively short period of time, lead to the elements, principles, and curricula of a comprehensive Baha'i education. But even with this cautious attitude, we need to ponder on what we are supposed to achieve in our Baha'i-inspired endeavors. How far can we and should we advance? The answer depends on our assessment of the direction of educational theory and practice in the world today on the one hand, and on our ability to advance in new directions on the other. As to the first consideration, our assessment of prevalent educational theories, we should heed this general warning of Shoghi Effendi. Let us be on our guard, lest we measure too strictly the divine plan with the standard of man. I'm not prepared to state that it agrees in principle or in method with the prevailing notions now uppermost in men's minds, nor that it should conform with those imperfect, precarious, and expedient measures feverishly resorted to by an agitated humanity. In this same passage, he asks of us uncompromising adherence to that which believe is the revealed and expressed will of God. However perplexing it might first appear, however at variance with the shadowy views, the impotent doctrines, the crude theories, the idle imaginings, the fashionable conceptions of a transient and troublous age. In the particular case of education, in a letter on behalf of The Guardian, we read, perhaps today, indeed, people today, indeed, do tend to be very superficial in their thinking. And it would seem as if the educational systems in use are sorely lacking in ability to produce a mature mind in a person who has reached supposedly adult life. All the outside influences that surround the individual seem to have an intensely distracting effect, and it is a hard job to get the average person to do any deep thinking or even a little meditation on the problems facing him and the world at large. Although this letter was written in 1939, one can hardly imagine that things are any better today. Educational systems the world over seem as impotent as then to nurture mature minds. There are too many thoughtful analyses of the shortcomings of today's educational systems and processes for anyone to deny that the crisis of education has continued to deepen from decade to decade. And there is no reason for me to dwell on this matter in my presentation today. As to the second consideration, namely our ability to advance in new directions, the Baha'i community certainly has the ability to make significant strides in advancing Bahá'í-inspired education. But so much depends on our appreciation of the nature and the magnitude of the work and how much we expect from ourselves and how willing we are to do the hard work required. We could, if we wish, choose a minimum definition of a Baha'i-inspired educational endeavor. It is simply an educational effort carried out by a group of Baha'is and their friends, inspired by the vision and the teachings of the faith. It strives to incorporate Baha'i principles in the content and the processes of the programs being offered, particularly the principles of the oneness of humankind, of equality between men and women, and the elimination of prejudice. It inculcates world citizenship and the virtues of an upright character. However, as far as educational practice per se is concerned, it simply moves in the frontiers of progressive education at any given time, according to the training the Baha'is involved have received. Behaviorism a few decades ago, a a combination of computationalism and culturalism sometime later, then emphasis on behavioral objectives or outcome-based curricula, and more recently, constructivism, and then whatever is coming next. This would be the minimum definition of a Bahá'í-inspired educational effort. Alternatively, we could be somewhat more ambitious, and that is the approach I would like to propose. We would value whatever insights we are able to get from established theories and draw on them whenever it is appropriate. But at the same time, be engaged in a rigorous search for educational contents and methods that would progressively endow each generation with the characteristics of a human race entering the age of maturity. The beloved guardian has told us that the supreme and distinguishing function of Baha'u'llah's revelation is the calling into being of a new race of man. A race of man are Baha'u'llah's words, incomparable in character, shall be raised up, which with the feet of detachment will tread under all who are in heaven and on earth, and will cast the sleeve of holiness over all that has been created from water and clay. What is rather obvious in this regard is that no matter how far in the future human beings of such extraordinary powers and incomparable character are to appear, their appearance will not be a sudden phenomenon. It can't be that for the longest time, human beings are to behave more or less the same as they do today, and then all of a sudden a new humanity comes into being, as if by magic. A process has to be in motion through which notable changes in character and powers of a growing number of individuals will take deeper and deeper root from generation to generation. Education, the methods and contents of which will have to be systematically developed over time, will be most significant component of this process. There are a number of questions then that suggest themselves. The moment we place such a heavy requirement on Bahá'í-inspired education, is what we know about education today, including the knowledge contained in such fields as sociology of education, philosophy of education, psychology, ethics, philosophy of mind, neuroscience, sufficient to enable us educate souls who will cast the sleeve of holiness over all that has been created from water and clay? The answer is clearly no, far from it. The next question then is whether there is enough knowledge in these fields to show us a way forward, at least enabling us to take the first few steps in the desired direction. I would like to suggest that our answer to this second question should not be overly pessimistic. What we need to do is to follow the guidance in the document approved by the Universal House of Justice, which I quoted at the beginning of this presentation. We need to look at our Bahá'í-inspired efforts as components of a long-term process of action and reflection in the light of Baha'u'llah's revelation. We have to become well-versed in the theories and practices of the field of education and fields that are closely associated with it. We should be engaged in a rigorous process that generates new knowledge that is openly shared. As it has been said many times, to advance in this process, we should look at theories and practices as sources of insights that enrich our own experience. But we will have to avoid fads, be humble, and avoid vainglory, not make unreasonable claims, and cling scrupulously to the standards of honesty and rectitude of conduct. Certainly, this is a highly challenging enterprise. We need to figure out how to look in the rapidly growing river of knowledge flowing through the world for clues and indications that would help us to solve the innumerable puzzles we will find on our way. We need to discover one by one the elements of an educational process that will incrementally, to be sure, cultivate the kind of person whom Baha'u'llah has envisioned. And we need to refine these elements as we learn from experience and begin to make conceptual advances and articulate the new insights we gain. Everything we do in this complex process, in this complex enterprise, presents us with its own challenges. And we need to learn more and more how to organize and reorganize our process of action, reflection, study, and consultation to meet these challenges. In this connection, the way we interact with existing educational theories and practices needs special attention. A recurring difficulty relates to the adoption, with or without modification, of ideas, methods, and even content of educational practices with some of the underlying assumptions of which we have profound disagreements. For example, we do not believe that the human mind is a supercomputer. Yet there are aspects of the functioning of the brain that lend themselves to its treatment as such. Computationalism of the cognitive movement, then, does have insights to offer us when we are seeking to enhance certain aspects of the operation of the mind in an educational process. However, we need to be able to pick appropriate elements of the cognitive movement to be incorporated into a Bahá'í-inspired educational endeavor for specific purposes, while making sure we avoid the tendency to shy away from a more holistic encounter with the human mind, a tendency that robs the teaching-learning experience from the richness it deserves. The same holds for culturalism, the complement to computationalism, which proposes that education should initiate the young into a culture, helping them to become participants in processes that constantly negotiate, create, and recreate meaning. To say that culture plays a significant role in how human beings develop from infancy is an obvious statement with which no one can disagree. For us, our educational efforts should enable each generation of youth to contribute more decisively than the previous one to the construction of a new culture and a new civilization. Insights from theories based on culturalism then are bound to be of some help to us. But no matter how much truth there is in the statement that knowledge is socially constructed, we cannot totally subscribe to constructivism and deny the existence of a reality that is the final arbiter determining the validity of the knowledge being constructed, or ignore the fact that this reality has both a material and a spiritual dimension. So how do we make sure then that our Bahá'í-inspired efforts avoid the extremes of both determinism and radical constructivism, and instead nurture individuals who can harmonize the constructing powers of their thoughts and actions with reality, not vain imaginings, and with the will of God and his purpose for humanity? To be able to do all of this, we will have to rely on a robust framework for Bahá'í-inspired education, and we are only beginning to elaborate. I should mention at this point that gaining insight and carefully modifying elements of existing practices on our way to discovering new and more effective practices is not the same thing as eclecticism. Science cannot advance if it is required to accommodate every view in the pursuit of a hazy notion of inclusivity. Some things work and some things do not. For some things, there is a great deal of evidence, and for some things, there is none. And some notions prevalent in society today are simply dangerous. To illustrate this point, I would like to examine briefly the question of emotivism. Emotivism, the doctrine that our judgments about truth are no more than expressions of preference, attitude, or feeling, has deeply penetrated our culture, and many strands of progressive education find affinity with its underlying premises. The resulting emotivist self is moved only by personal feelings and preferences. For such an individual, rational arguments contribute little to moral judgments. Agreements are to be reached through the expression of feelings and the force they exert to produce the same effect on others. The full exercise of choice is the hallmark of an emotivist, for whom it is not the choice between good and evil that matters, but the free rein given to the self to choose. The world, in the eyes of the emotivist, is a meeting place of individuals, each with their own set of preferences, exerting their own will, and a stage which presents a series of opportunities for their enjoyments and for the achievement of their own satisfaction. This emotivist self is not nurtured in our modern times by mass media and advertising alone, but also by educational approaches that reduce morality to personal preference, while denying not only the existence of a divine purpose, but also of truth, moral or otherwise, outside the subjective self. How different is the emotivist self from the image the writings portray of what the human being must become, albeit not in so near a future. In this connection, we may call to mind these words of Baha'u'llah: "O my servant, thou art even as a finely tempered sword, concealed in the darkness of its sheath, and its value hidden from the artificer's knowledge. Wherefore, come forth from the sheath of self and desire, that thy worth may be made resplendent and manifest unto all the world." And again, "O Son of Man, if thou lovest me, turn away from thyself. And if thou seekest my pleasure, regard not thine own, that thou mayest die in me, and I may eternally live in thee." This brief reference to emotivism and the devastating influence it is having in today's social and political structures and processes is only meant to illustrate the care with which we need to examine current educational theories and practices. How many of the educational activities in which our children and youth participate during their many years of formal education actually end up contributing to the creation and strengthening of the emotivist self, we may ask. And emotivism, of course, is just one among the many doctrines that stand in direct opposition to the kind of system of thought and practice that would, in the fullness of time, give rise to those who, incomparable in character, will tread under all who are in heaven and earth with the feet of detachment and cast the sleeve of holiness over all that has been created from water and clay. So here we are in our endeavor to advance in Bahá'í-inspired education, having to learn and borrow ideas, methods, and content from current educational theories and practices, and at the same time having to be constantly on guard in order to avoid the adverse effects that these theory and practices can produce in the psyche of the human being. This implies that we have to approach the action, reflection, study, and consultation that defines every one of our efforts with great care. We should remember that the concept, categories, and principles that the field of education has so far produced will have to undergo fundamental transformation. And we will have to find the courage to elaborate concepts inspired by the revelation that have so often been neglected. I hope to illustrate the nature of what we need to do by saying a few words about one task: the elaboration of a comprehensive conception of understanding, and closely related to it, a rich account of spiritual qualities. Remembering that this is but one among a multitude of tasks we need to undertake as we try to advance in Bahá'í-inspired education. Understanding has, of course, been an important theme in education and philosophy, but needs to be recast in light of the revelation. The notion of spiritual qualities as a category of the attributes of the human being, of the human soul, has often been neglected or lost in the muddled narratives of virtues, which include culture-specific dispositions, social dexterities, and mental as well as physical skills. There is much to be done to clarify the nature of these constituents of our being and how they are to be systematically developed. The two conceptions of understanding and of spiritual qualities are intimately related, and Baha'is are in a unique position to treat them at the appropriate level of depth, both in theory and practice. Even a cursory survey of the writings impresses upon us that for human beings to manifest such powers of the human spirit as the power of justice, of humble service, of pure and goodly deeds, and of love, both the individual and the human race have to reach new shores of understanding. To help humanity move toward this goal, education is in need of a proper conception of understanding, a conception inspired by the writings that help us to transcend the duality between nature and nurture, between student-centered education and education focused on content, between subjective and objective knowledge. It is time to free ourselves from the grip that both Locke and Rousseau, as well as their offsprings, the creators of fad after fad have had on our minds. To nurture understanding, we have to deal at least with three interrelated and inseparable entities: the subject of understanding, the student possessing actual and latent intellectual and moral attributes, the objects of understanding, objects of varying degrees of complexity that are to be grasped and acted upon, and the process of understanding, the process by which greater and greater measures of truth and insight into reality and the way it is to be transformed are gained. The methods through which the student is helped to advance in understanding depends, of course, on what it is that is to be understood. So the process of understanding of every object cannot be reduced to the application of a single approach: cognitive, cultural, empirical, constructivist, and so on. Equally, the process of understanding is conceived in light of an explicit or implicit conception of the subject of understanding. A highly complex computer in computationalism, a negotiator of values in culturalism, and so on. For us, the process of understanding has to correspond to the conception of the subject of understanding invoked by Baha'u'llah's vision of the new race of man. And just as we cannot separate the process of understanding from the object and subject of understanding, it would be a mistake to sharply separate the subject and the object of understanding. The understanding of a specific set of objects, say scientific concepts, contributes to the development of certain qualities and attitudes, intellectual and even spiritual. And clearly, the understanding of any set of scientific concepts demands the development of relevant qualities and attitudes. Reality is one, and there is continuity between its physical, its intellectual, and its spiritual dimensions. Concepts that help us understand this complex reality are not isolated and self-contained, but closely interrelated and intermingling. So understanding in this respect cannot be circumscribed. There is a boundlessness to it, and nurturing it requires that we do not view it as mere achievement, whether theoretical or practical, at a given time. In a certain sense, understanding is a notion that defies all manner of definition. It is not synonymous with how the human mind sorts out and processes information. It is not merely a culminating point at which one arrives once certain facts are assimilated. It is not simply the conclusion reached after following one or another procedure. Nor is it reducible to judgments by way of sound reasoning based on the belief one holds. Understanding differs from physical action, say planting a tree, and mental occupation, say thinking about what to do. It is also distinct from mental activity involved in gathering and sorting information. All these contribute to understanding, especially when carried out purposefully, but they do not make up the process in its entirety. As one advances in understanding, at least in relation to substantive concepts, there are significant moments of insight and grasp of specific facts and meanings. but the process is more like moving forward along a path, which, though marked by certain milestones, has by no means a predetermined end. To nurture understanding according to this vision, we must remember that the subject of understanding advances in the understanding of reality with the aid of God's grace and bestowals. Understanding is, in the final analysis, a gift bestowed upon us by God. First and foremost among these favors, states Baha'u'llah, which the Almighty hath conferred upon man, is the gift of understanding. When we examine carefully the many passages in which the word understanding is employed in the writings, we see that it is not only mentioned in the context of truth that we need to apprehend, but it often refers to an attribute of the soul, as an adjective that describes the person. It, like spiritual qualities, such as justice, love, generosity, and truthfulness, can be seen as a constituent of who we are. We know, of course, that spiritual qualities are reflections of divine attributes in the mirror of the human heart. The development of these qualities defines the capacity of the human soul to set itself on its infinite journey towards God. Understanding, too, is a crucial determining factor of this capacity. Here then appears a profound connection between understanding and spiritual qualities. And in the context of Bahá'í-Inspired education, between fostering spiritual qualities and nurturing understanding. This would be an obvious connection if we were to refer only to the understanding of concepts directly associated with one or another spiritual quality. To understand, for example, the concept of selfless giving, of forgiveness, of sympathy, and so on, in the development of generosity as a spiritual quality is obvious. But the claim here is significantly greater. What is being said is that the challenge before Bahá'í-inspired educational endeavors is to learn to engage simultaneously in fostering spiritual qualities and nurturing the understanding of concepts, not only belonging to the spiritual realm, but also to the realms of the physical and social sciences, to literature and the arts, to history and political thought. It is a call to scale the walls that tend to separate education directed to the material and social aspects of human existence from education focused on moral and spiritual life. It is a call for integration at a level that has not been achieved before. Now, to systematically attend to this twofold task, Bahá'í-inspired education is in need of a rich account of spiritual qualities in a language clear enough to allow the design and evaluation of educational activity. This language must embrace an expanded rationality that draws on the languages of religion, science, the arts, and philosophy. And in developing such a language, we need to avoid relativism and moral equivalency. The language has to set a direction, a higher and a lower, but avoid moralizing. There is a qualitative contrast between the noble and the base, which should not be blurred. The language must be capable of conveying a vision of human existence, extending beyond the requirements of day-to-day life. the understanding achieved with its aid is to enable the student to distinguish between superficial and lasting results of one's words and actions, directing moral purpose towards that which has permanence. The account of spiritual qualities we need to elaborate should address their autonomous and permanent nature, as well as the evolutionary changes in their meanings as humanity advances from its childhood to maturity. Spiritual qualities are not bound to their expressions in finite contexts, no matter how much our capacity to manifest them expands. They exist on a transcendent and autonomous plane, vital structures in that dimension of reality we call spiritual. Ponder for a moment on these words of Baha'u'llah, describing how one day in the Garden of Rizwan, he gazed on one of the beauties of the most sublime paradise, standing on a pillar of light and calling aloud, saying, "O inmates of earth and heaven, behold ye my beauty and my radiance, and my revelation and my effulgence. By God, the true one, I am trustworthiness and the revelation thereof, and the beauty thereof. I will recompense whosoever will cleave unto me and recognize my rank and station, and hold fast unto my hem. I am the most great ornament of the people of Baha, and the vesture of glory unto all who are in the kingdom of creation. I am the supreme instrument for the prosperity of the world and the horizon of assurance unto all beings." In our account of spiritual quality, consciousness of the autonomous and non-exhaustive nature of them is essential, as they express themselves in changing finite contexts. But we should remember that spiritual qualities are not independent of each other. Our account would have to explore the dynamic interaction among spiritual qualities. Although spiritual qualities are to express themselves in action, our account of them cannot be limited to observable behavior. Yet such an account does have to offer us at least a qualitative measure of how we advance in the acquisition of spiritual qualities. Here is where the concept of service takes the center stage. Service refers to those acts that are carried by the twofold moral purpose and seek the transformation of one or another aspect of the essential relationships that define human existence. The image of a path is being used more and more in the Baha'i community to visualize effort and movement, as well as resilience to overcome difficulties. A path of service invites participation, and participants advance along it at different paces and strides. One does not walk the path alone. There is faith in the capacity of others and joy in their accomplishments. Walking the path of service is contingent on one's state of being. The efficacy of service is not evaluated only by the perceived success or failure of an enterprise, but also by the extent to which understanding has advanced and the necessary spiritual qualities have been developed. This is not an evaluation carried by others from outside, but by every single participant. Further, the reality of service is not connected to specific actions. It pervades the environment with a potency to transform the relationships that shape that environment. Service changes selfish grumble to selfless joy in giving, greedy exploitation to reciprocity and fairness, and arrogant knowing to a humble posture of learning. Although service is manifested through action, it is inseparable from one's state of being. It unites doing and being. At a most fundamental level, it is a requirement of what it is to be human. That one indeed is a man who today dedicated himself to the service of the entire human race. Let me pause here and enumerate quickly some of the points I have mentioned in my presentation today. I have tried to argue that in order to advance significantly in Baha'i-inspired education, we need to keep in mind Baha'u'llah's extraordinary vision of the human being who will walk this earth in the fullness of time. And while respectful of accomplishments in the field of education, we need to remember that in its present state, it is incapable of cultivating such an individual. Humbled by the realization of the magnitude of the work ahead, a growing number of us, together with other like-minded individuals, would have to labor in diverse cultural and ecological settings, identifying educational needs, developing a coherent set of ideas, and creating a series of teaching learning experiences in a systematic process that involves action, namely carrying out educational activities and evaluating them, reflection on action, consultation, and analysis of advances in educational theory, not as a linear sequence, but often in parallel, leading to repeated modification of ideas, methods, and materials. In this way, through a series of approximation, curricular elements would emerge to be shared with others engaged in a similar process. I have suggested that this process, which in fact is already advancing in several places in the Baha'i world, can contribute significantly to theoretical advance as long as action is carried out within an evolving conceptual framework. The knowledge being generated from various experiences is systematized, and educational theory is considered a source of insight and not a set of truths to be adhered at all costs. With this picture in mind, I have tried to describe a few of the challenges we invariably face as we pursue the distant goal of Baha'i education. The brief discussion of emotivism was to illustrate the capacity we need to develop to identify and analyze the false doctrines that tend to invade educational theory and practice. The brief mention of the cognitive and other movements was to show that we could indeed gain insights from various educational theories, even when we disagree with some of their basic assumptions. But our interaction with existing theory and practice, I have argued, constitutes only one component of our Baha'i-inspired endeavors. We also have to face the challenge of elaborating new ideas and transforming some of the old ones, based on an ever deeper understanding of the implication of Baha'u'llah's revelation. This brief discussion of a conception of understanding and a corresponding account of spiritual qualities was intended to illustrate the nature of only one of the multitude of tasks before us as we go about elaborating the elements of an evolving conceptual framework that is to govern our efforts to design and implement Baha'i-inspired curricular elements. If I may, I would like to conclude this presentation by asking and attempting to answer a question that naturally comes to mind in relation to the approach described here. Why should we be so confident that such an approach will actually enable us in Baha'i-inspired education, to advance in Baha'i-inspired education? The only way I can answer this question at this point is to say that the source of the confidence is the rather impressive accomplishments of endeavors that have followed this approach in the Baha'i world. Admittedly, the number of such endeavors is not large, but the diversity of settings in which certain educational processes are resulting in visible transformation seems to justify some degree of confidence in the approach. A brief look at the program for the spiritual empowerment of junior youth, with which we are all familiar, will serve to illustrate my point. Action and reflection began many years ago in Colombia when it was noticed that the faith was attracting young people between the ages of 12 and 15 in large numbers. They tended to form a very special kind of attachment to the cause and its ideals. Over the years, the process was extended to more and more regions, and reflections on the results made it clear that much of the literature on the characteristics of this age group was bound to specific cultures and historical circumstances, and did not offer sufficient insight into the reality of a human being during their early adolescence. The life of only one youth, Ruhollah Varga, falsified many of the prevalent theories about this age group. A different description of a junior youth gradually emerged from the action, reflection, study, and consultation that was carried out and was recorded in book 5 of the Ruhi Institute. The degree of transformation of tens of thousands of youth who have benefited from this program is a testimony to the efficacy of its content and the concepts that underlie it. I would like to mention just 2 sets of insights very quickly that have contributed to the accomplishments of the program. One related to the relationship between the structure of language and moral structure in the human mind, and the other to the all-important question of spiritual perception. As to the first, repeated reference in the writings to the influence of utterance leaves no doubt as to the significant role language plays in cultivating moral as well as intellectual powers of the individual. Language structure is extremely complex, and in exploring it, one has to consider, among other things, words and their meanings, grammar and syntax. Words are not piled up together arbitrarily in a language. They are situated within its structure, and they take their meaning from the connection they have with other concepts. These connections help us understand the meaning of words, phrases, sentences, and paragraphs. Some of the connections are obvious, such as the one between the noun chair and the verb to sit. But not all connections are so immediate and obvious. Bahá'í-inspired educational endeavors can be guided by the wealth of meaning enshrined in the sacred writings to discover and create connections among words and concepts that go beyond the obvious and the immediate. The objective would be to open channels in the mind and the heart of a young person, leading to profound insights into reality and the way it can be transformed. Focus would be on the intimate relationship between language structure and moral structure. If you examine the Human Temple, a textbook inspired by Baha'u'llah's Tablet of Heykal, you will see examples of the modest efforts of the junior youth program to address such an objective. That which is closely associated in the language structure in the mind of a youth with a verb as common as to see, for example, has significant effect on the moral structure governing that youth's thought and behavior. Thus, the deliberate effort to connect in a natural way the verb to see with such words as knowledge, mind, observing, thinking, and understanding, seeing with the light of sun, seeing with the light of knowledge, seeing with our mind, seeing friends, not strangers, and thinking of unity. As to the second question of enhancing spiritual perception, I would like to briefly mention only 2 insights. The first idea is that the enhancement of spiritual perception requires the removal of veils covering the inner eye. the veils of passion and desire, the veils of covetousness, greed and envy, of vain imaginings and idle fancy, the veil of egotism. The challenge before us is not just the suppression of inordinate passions and desires, curbing greed and envy, and restricting the operation of ego so that people can be civil to each other. It is to rent them asunder. Would we be wrong to assume that the human being Baha'u'llah has envisioned walking the earth in the fullness of time will have succeeded in burning away these veils? How does Bahá'í-inspired education help the individual take decisive steps in realizing this vision? The second idea in relation to enhancement of spiritual perception is that enhancing spiritual perception requires us to set aside the duality between mind and heart. Some schools of thought believe that emotions and sentiments hinder the operation of rational thinking. Others recommend suspending reason and objectivity in order to allow emotions such as care and sympathy to be manifested. Even spiritual qualities tend to be divided. We love with the heart, and we exercise justice through the power of the mind. This rift between feelings and thoughts reduces our understanding of both and creates an artificial barrier, an artificial picture of the interacting faculties of the human soul. We need to realize that sentiments such as love and respect, which transcend the self, are vitalized by appropriate thoughts, just as noble thoughts are powered by appropriate self-transcending emotions, such as passion for truth, yearning for justice, and attraction to beauty. In not making an artificially sharp distinction between thoughts and sentiments, we are realizing that there is a spiritual as well as an intellectual dimension to perception, in which both thinking and feeling take part. Here too, it is noteworthy how even a small effort to cultivate the perception of forces that emanate in the realm of the spirit, such as divine confirmation and hope, and an attempt to set aside the duality between heart and mind, in treating a theme such as excellence, has appealed to so many junior youth and has had such transformative effects on them. Clearly, this brief reference to the question of language and spiritual perception does not do them justice, but my purpose in mentioning them has only been to illustrate how we can make incremental advances in Bahá'í-inspired education. And there is every reason to believe that these modest achievements will accumulate and lead to significant progress. What I have suggested in my presentation today is that more and more of us need to fix our eyes, to the extent we can, on the vision of the human being Baha'u'llah intends to raise. Gain a more profound understanding of the attributes of that human being, and through a systematic process of action, reflection, study, and consultation, take the necessary small steps. In this process, we need not be too attached to prevalent educational theories and systems. We should create a milieu that does not favor fads or the dominance of technique over substance. We should do our best to integrate spiritual insights gained from the study of the teachings and their application to the life of humanity with knowledge generated through painstaking scientific research, and we should not shy away from tackling vigorously the formidable challenges that moving towards Baha'u'llah's vision of a completely transformed human being and a new civilization entails. Thank you.